The invoice sitting on my kitchen counter looked legitimate enough, but something about the letterhead made my stomach drop. It was the third time in 6 months that Prestige Community Management had raised our HOA fees, and this time they wanted an additional $2,000 for emergency repairs that nobody in Riverside Meadows had ever seen happen. I lived in a quiet subdivision outside Phoenix, Arizona, where the summer heat baked the pavement, and the HOA rules seemed to multiply like cacti in the desert. My wife Sarah and I had moved into our 3-bedroom ranch-style home 4 years ago, drawn by the promise of a peaceful community with well-maintained common areas and reasonable fees. For the first 2 years, everything had been fine. Then Patricia Hendricks became HOA president, and suddenly our monthly dues jumped from $150 to $300, with quarterly special assessments that seemed to materialize out of thin air. I grabbed my phone and called my neighbor Mike, who lived 3 houses down and had been complaining about the fees even louder than I had. He answered on the second ring, his voice already irritated before I even explained why I was calling. "Another assessment," Mike said. "That's absolute garbage. What are they even doing with all this money? The pool still has that crack in it from last summer, half the streetlights are burned out, and someone tagged the fence by the entrance 2 months ago and it's still sitting there." "That's exactly what I'm thinking," I said, staring at the invoice again. "This company, Prestige Community Management, I've never actually seen anyone from their office at any of the board meetings." "Have you?" Mike was quiet for a moment. "You know what? No. Patricia always says she's in communication with them, but I've never seen a representative show up in person. They supposedly handle all our financials, maintenance coordination, all of it." "I'm going to do some digging," I told him. "Something doesn't smell right." That evening, after Sarah went to bed, I opened my laptop and started searching. Prestige Community Management had a website that looked professional enough, with stock photos of happy communities and buzzwords about excellence in property management and transparent financial practices. But when I clicked on their Our Team page, there were no photos, just generic titles like Senior Property Manager and Financial Director with no actual names attached. I pulled up the Arizona Corporation Commission website and searched for their business registration. Prestige Community Management LLC had been incorporated 3 years ago, right around the time Patricia Hendricks had taken over as HOA president. The registered agent was listed as Robert Morrison with an address in Scottsdale, Robert Morrison. The name sounded familiar, but I could not place it immediately. I grabbed the folder where I kept all our HOA documents and flipped through the meeting minutes from the past few years. Then I found it. In the minutes from a board meeting 2 years ago, Patricia had mentioned her sister visiting from California with her husband Robert. My heart started beating faster. I went back to my laptop and started cross-referencing. Patricia Hendricks had a sister named Linda Morrison. Linda was married to Robert Morrison, the same Robert Morrison who was the registered agent for Prestige Community Management. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. The HOA president's brother-in-law ran the management company that handled all of our money. That had to be a conflict of interest at minimum, possibly fraud depending on how deep this went. The next morning, I called Mike again and told him what I had found. He let out a long whistle. "That's shady as hell," he said. "What do we do about it?" "I think we need to request the financial records," I said. "As homeowners, we're entitled to see where our money is going. Let's see what they show us." Mike agreed to come over that afternoon, and we drafted a formal letter requesting copies of all financial statements, invoices, and contracts between the HOA and Prestige Community Management for the past 3 years. We cited the Arizona Planned Community Act, which gave homeowners the right to inspect HOA records. I printed 2 copies, and Mike and I both signed them. The next day was a Tuesday, and I knew Patricia would be at the community center for her usual office hours where residents could supposedly bring concerns to her attention. I had never actually gone to one of these sessions before, preferring to avoid Patricia's condescending smile, and the way she talked to everyone like they were children who did not understand how communities worked. Patricia was sitting at a folding table in the community center's main room when I walked in at exactly 10 in the morning. She was a woman in her mid-50s with blonde hair styled in a bob that looked like it required weekly salon maintenance, wearing a pressed white blouse and pearl earrings. Her smile was already fixed in place before she even looked up to see who had entered. "Good morning," she said in that saccharine voice she used at board meetings. "How can I help you today?" I placed the letter on the table in front of her. "I'm formally requesting access to the HOA's financial records, specifically all documents related to our contract with Prestige Community Management." Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. She picked up the letter and skimmed it, her eyes moving back and forth behind her reading glasses. "Well, this is certainly unusual," she said. "May I ask what prompted this request? I'm concerned about the increasing fees and special assessments," I said, keeping my voice level. "I want to understand where our money is going." Patricia set the letter down and folded her hands on the table. "I can assure you that all of our finances are completely transparent and above board. Prestige Community Management provides detailed quarterly reports to the board." "Then it should be no problem for me to review those reports," I said, her jaw tightened slightly. "The Arizona Planned Community Act does allow homeowners to inspect records, but there is a process. I'll need to submit your request to the board, and we'll schedule a time for you to review the documents at the community center with a board member present." "How long will that take?" "We have a board meeting next week." "I'll bring it up then, and we should be able to accommodate you within 10 business days after that." 2 weeks. She was stalling, I could feel it, but I also knew that pushing too hard right now might make her more defensive. "That's fine," I said. "I'll expect to hear from you." I turned to leave, but Patricia's voice stopped me. "You know, running an HOA is a lot of work," she said. "It's a thankless volunteer position, and we're all just trying to maintain property values for everyone's benefit. These fees aren't arbitrary. Everything costs more these days." I looked back at her. "I'm sure that's true. That's why I'd like to see exactly what we're paying for." Over the next week, I started talking to more neighbors. It turned out I was not the only one who had concerns. A woman named Jennifer who lived on the next street over told me she had tried to get financial records 6 months ago and had been given what she called the runaround until she finally gave up. An older couple, the Johnsons, mentioned that they had been fined $300 for having the wrong shade of beige paint on their trim, even though they had used the exact color from the approved list. "Patricia told us the list had been updated," Mrs. Johnson said, shaking her head. "But nobody ever notified us. It felt like they were just looking for reasons to fine people." Mike had been doing his own investigation. He came over one evening with a folder full of notes. "I've been looking at the county records for permits," he said, spreading papers across my dining room table. "Remember that emergency roof repair on the clubhouse that they charged us $8,000 for last year? There's no permit on file. For a job that size, they would have needed a permit." "Maybe they did it under the table," I suggested. "Maybe, but why would a legitimate management company do that? It opens them up to liability. And look at this." He pulled out another document. "I requested the contractor's license information for the company that supposedly did the work. The business name on our assessment notice doesn't match any licensed contractor in Arizona." This was bigger than I had thought. We were not just talking about a conflict of interest anymore. If the repairs never happened, or if they were massively overcharged, that was embezzlement. The 10 business days came and went with no word from Patricia. I sent her an email reminder and got back a terse response saying that the board was working on compiling the documents and needed a few more days. Then a few more days became a week, then 2 weeks. Finally, I received an email from Patricia saying that I could come review the financial documents the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. Mike said he wanted to come with me, so I forwarded him the information. When Tuesday arrived, Mike and I showed up at the community center at exactly 2 o'clock. Patricia was there, along with another board member named George, a retired accountant who mostly seemed to agree with whatever Patricia said. They had set up several large binders on the folding table. "These are copies of our financial records for the past 3 years, Patricia said, gesturing to the binders. "You're welcome to review them here. We ask that you don't remove any documents from the premises, and if you want copies of anything specific, we can provide those for 25 cents per page." Mike and I sat down and started going through the binders. There were bank statements, invoices, and what looked like monthly management reports from Prestige Community Management. The invoices all appeared professional, with line items for landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, and various repairs. But as I looked closer, things started to seem off. The landscaping invoices were from a company called Desert Green Landscapes. I had never seen their trucks in our neighborhood. We definitely had landscaping service. Someone mowed the common areas and trimmed the bushes. But I had seen the trucks, and they said AAA Landscape Services on the side. I made a note and kept reading. The pool maintenance invoices were from Aquatech Pool Service, but I knew for a fact that our pool guy drove a white van that said Blue Wave Pools on it, because I had chatted with him several times during the summer. "Can I get copies of all the invoices from Prestige Community Management?" I asked Patricia. She pursed her lips. "That's going to be quite a few pages. Are you sure you want all of them?" "Yes, all of them," she sighed dramatically. "Fine, we'll have to make the copies and mail them to you. With the copying fee, that'll be around $75. "That's fine," I said, pulling out my wallet. I paid her in cash, and she wrote me a receipt with obvious irritation. Mike was flipping through another binder, and I saw his eyes widen. He caught my attention and turned the binder so I could see what he was looking at. It was a contract between Riverside Meadows HOA and Prestige Community Management. The management fee was 10% of all collected HOA dues, plus an additional administrative fee of $500 per month. With 200 homes in our community, and dues of $300 per month, that meant the HOA was collecting $60,000 per month. 10% of that was $6,000, plus the $500 administrative fee. Prestige Community Management was being paid $78,000 per year to manage our HOA. That seemed extremely high, but what caught Mike's attention was something else. At the bottom of the contract, in small print, it stated that Prestige Community Management would handle all vendor selection and payment processing, and that they would receive a finder's fee of 5% on all contracted work. This was a kickback scheme. Prestige Community Management was choosing vendors, possibly fake vendors, inflating the costs, and then taking a percentage off the top. And Patricia's brother-in-law ran the whole operation. Mike took out his phone and started taking pictures of the contract. Patricia immediately stood up. "Excuse me, no photographs," she said sharply. "If you want copies, you need to pay for copies. The Arizona Planned Community Act allows us to inspect and copy records," Mike said, not lowering his phone. "It doesn't say we have to use your copy machine." Patricia's face flushed red. "George, is that correct?" George cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, technically, the law does say homeowners can make copies, but it doesn't specify the method." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue more, but she just sat back down with a huff. Mike continued photographing pages while I made a list of every invoice I wanted copies of. We spent 2 hours at the community center, documenting everything we could. By the time we left, I had a clearer picture of what was happening. Prestige Community Management was funneling our HOA money through fake or inflated invoices, taking their management fee and kickbacks off the top, and Patricia was either in on it or willfully ignorant. That evening, I sat down with Sarah and explained everything I had found. She listened quietly, her expression growing more concerned. "This is fraud," she said when I finished. "You need to report this to the police or the Attorney General or someone." "I want to make sure I have solid evidence first," I said. "Right now, I have suspicious invoices and a conflict of interest, but I need to prove that the money is actually being stolen." "How are you going to do that?" I thought about it for a moment. "I'm going to track down these vendors and see if they're even real." The next day, I started making phone calls. Desert Green Landscapes had a phone number listed on the invoices. When I called it, I got a disconnected message. I tried looking them up online and found no website, no business listing, nothing. As far as I could tell, Desert Green Landscapes did not exist. Aquatech Pool Service had the same problem. The phone number went to a voicemail that was full and could not accept new messages. No website, no business license on file with the state. I called the actual landscaping company I had seen in our neighborhood, AAA Landscape Services. A friendly woman answered and transferred me to the owner, a guy named Carlos. "Yeah, we do the landscaping for Riverside Meadows," Carlos confirmed. "Have for about 4 years now." "Can I ask who you bill for your services?" I said. "We send our invoices directly to Prestige Community Management," he said. "They pay us monthly." "Why, is there a problem?" No problem," I said. "Just doing some accounting review." "Can you tell me roughly what your monthly invoice is for our community?" Carlos hesitated. "I mean, I probably should not share specific numbers, but it's around $2,000 a month. That covers mowing, trimming, seasonal planting, irrigation repair, the usual stuff." "That's very helpful, thank you," I said. After I hung up, I pulled out the invoice I had gotten copies of from Patricia. The invoice from Desert Green Landscapes for the same month Carlos had mentioned was for $6,000. Someone was pocketing the $4,000 difference. I called Mike and told him what I had found. He let out a low whistle. "So they're billing the HOA triple what they're actually paying the vendor," he said. "Multiply that by every service we use every month for 3 years. It's got to be hundreds of thousands of dollars," I said. "We need to go to the police," Mike said. "This is way beyond HOA drama. This is organized fraud." I agreed. The next morning, I compiled all of my evidence. The invoices, the photographs Mike had taken, the notes from my phone calls with vendors, the proof that Robert Morrison was Patricia's brother-in-law, and put it all in a folder. Then Mike and I drove to the Phoenix Police Department. The officer at the front desk directed us to the White-Collar Crimes Division. We sat in a small waiting area until a detective named Sarah Chen came out to meet us. She was in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. We spent an hour in her office, walking her through everything we had found. She took notes, asked questions, and examined the documents we had brought. "This is a good start," she said when we finished. "The conflict of interest between the HOA president and the management company is definitely concerning, and these fake invoices suggest fraud. But I'm going to be honest with you. HOA cases can be complicated. We need to prove that money was actually stolen, and we need to show intent." "What else do you need from us?" I asked. "I'd like to get copies of the HOA's bank statements," Detective Chen said. "That will show us exactly where the money is going. We'll also need to interview some of these vendors to confirm they were either paid less than what was billed or that they don't exist at all. This is going to take some time to build a solid case." "How long?" Mike asked. "Could be a few months," she said. "Possibly longer if they've been careful about covering their tracks. In the meantime, I'd recommend that you don't tip off Patricia or anyone at Prestige Community Management that you've come to the police. If they know we're investigating, they might start destroying evidence." Mike and I agreed. We thanked Detective Chen and left the police station feeling both relieved that someone official was taking this seriously and frustrated that it would be such a long process. Over the next few weeks, I tried to act normal at HOA functions. There was a community barbecue that Patricia organized, and I forced myself to show up and make small talk. Patricia was her usual cheerful self, thanking everyone for their continued support and reminding people to pay their special assessments on time. "We have some exciting projects coming up," she announced to the gathered crowd. Prestige Community Management has been working on plans to renovate the clubhouse and install new security cameras at all the entrances. It's going to really enhance our community. More projects meant more inflated invoices and more money disappearing into Robert Morrison's pocket. I glanced at Mike across the crowd, and he shook his head slightly. We just had to wait for the police investigation to run its course, but then something unexpected happened. A newer resident named Amanda, who had moved in about 6 months ago, approached me at the barbecue. She was a lawyer who worked in corporate compliance, and she had heard through the neighborhood grapevine that I had been asking questions about the HOA finances. "Can we talk somewhere private?" she asked quietly. We walked away from the crowd, stopping near the empty tennis courts. Amanda glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. "I've been doing some digging on my own," she said. "I used to work in forensic accounting before I went to law school. I requested copies of the HOA financial records a few weeks ago, and I've found some things that I think you should know about." She pulled out her phone and showed me a spreadsheet she had created. "Look at the pattern of special assessments over the past 3 years. They always happen right before a major holiday or during summer vacation, times when people are distracted and less likely to ask questions. And the amounts are always just under $10,000, which is probably intentional." "Why does 10,000 matter?" I asked. "Because financial institutions have to report transactions over $10,000 to the federal government," Amanda explained. "It's an anti-money laundering regulation. If they keep the assessments under that threshold, they avoid triggering reporting requirements." "That's called structuring, isn't it?" I said, remembering something I had read. "That's illegal." "Exactly," Amanda said. "If you can prove they're deliberately structuring these transactions to avoid reporting, that's a federal crime. This could be bigger than just HOA fraud." I told Amanda about Detective Chen and the investigation that was already underway. She offered to share her analysis with the police and to help build the case using her forensic accounting background. "The more evidence we have, the stronger the case will be," she said. "These people need to be held accountable." Over the next month, Amanda worked her magic with spreadsheets and financial documents. She tracked every dollar that had flowed through the HOA accounts for the past 3 years, cross-referencing invoices with actual payments, identifying discrepancies, and building a timeline of suspicious activity. It was meticulous, detailed work, and it painted a damning picture. Prestige Community Management had stolen approximately $340,000 from Riverside Meadows HOA over 3 years. They had done it through fake vendor invoices, inflated costs, kickbacks, and pocketing special assessment funds that were supposedly for repairs that never happened. Robert Morrison had funneled most of the money into his personal accounts, though there were also transfers to an account that belonged to Patricia Hendricks. Patricia was not just complicit, she was actively involved. She had received roughly $70,000 in kickbacks over the 3 years, disguised as consulting fees for her work on the HOA board. Amanda compiled everything into a comprehensive report and sent it to Detective Chen. A week later, Detective Chen called me and asked if I could come to the police station. When I arrived, she had another detective with her, along with an attorney from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. They wanted to walk through everything one more time, and they had questions about specific transactions and timeline details. The meeting lasted 3 hours, but by the end, the prosecutor said they had enough to move forward with charges. "We're going to arrest Robert Morrison and Patricia Hendricks," the prosecutor said. "We'll be charging them with fraud, embezzlement, theft, and conspiracy. The structuring allegations will be referred to federal prosecutors for potential additional charges. When will this happen? I asked. We're going to execute the arrests tomorrow morning, Detective Chen said. We want to catch them by surprise so they don't have time to destroy evidence or move money around. I wanted to give you a heads up because once this becomes public, things are going to get chaotic in your community. She was not wrong. The next morning, I watched from my front window as 2 police cars pulled up to Patricia's house 3 streets over. Neighbors started coming out of their homes, watching as Patricia was led out in handcuffs, her face pale and shocked. The police spent hours inside her house, presumably collecting evidence and documents. My phone started ringing almost immediately. Mike called, then Jennifer, then the Johnsons, then half a dozen other neighbors who had heard something was happening. I told them all the same thing, that the police had arrested Patricia for fraud related to the HOA finances, and that more information would be coming soon. The story hit the local news that evening. A reporter stood in front of our community entrance, explaining how an HOA president and her brother-in-law had allegedly stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from their community through a fake management company. Our community name, Riverside Meadows, was suddenly known throughout the Phoenix metro area, and not for good reasons. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The remaining HOA board members, George and 2 others, called an emergency meeting to address the situation. They hired a real attorney, not one of Patricia's friends, to advise them on how to move forward. The attorney recommended dissolving the contract with Prestige Community Management immediately and hiring a legitimate, established management company to take over operations. The HOA also filed a civil lawsuit against Robert Morrison, Patricia Hendricks, and Prestige Community Management to try to recover the stolen funds. The attorney explained that even if the criminal case was successful, the civil case was necessary to actually get the money back. Detective Chen called me a few days after the arrest to give me an update. Robert Morrison tried to move money out of the Prestige Community Management accounts as soon as he heard about Patricia's arrest, she said, but we had already frozen the accounts. We recovered about $120,000. Patricia had about $30,000 in her personal accounts that we also seized. The rest of the money is going to be harder to trace. It looks like some of it went to offshore accounts. Will they go to prison? I asked. If they're convicted, yes, Detective Chen said. The prosecutor is pushing for significant prison time given the amount stolen and the sophistication of the scheme. They'll probably offer plea deals, but we'll see if Morrison and Hendricks take them. The criminal case moved forward over the following months. Both Robert and Patricia initially pleaded not guilty, but as the evidence mounted and the prosecutor made it clear they had an airtight case, their attorneys started negotiating plea deals. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she had been manipulated by her brother-in-law, that she did not fully understand what was happening. But the bank records showing the $70,000 in kickbacks made that defense hard to swallow. Eventually, she agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and embezzlement in exchange for a reduced sentence. Robert Morrison held out longer, but when the federal prosecutors got involved and threatened additional charges related to the structuring and money laundering, his attorney advised him to take a deal as well. He pleaded guilty to fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in September. Mike, Amanda, Jennifer, the Johnsons, and about 20 other residents from Riverside Meadows showed up at the courthouse to watch. We filled 2 rows in the courtroom gallery. Patricia was sentenced first. The judge listened to her tearful apology, in which she claimed she had made a terrible mistake and let greed cloud her judgment. Then the judge listened to the prosecutor describe how Patricia had betrayed the trust of her neighbors and stolen their money for years while pretending to be a dedicated community volunteer. Mrs. Hendricks, you held a position of trust and responsibility, and you exploited that position for personal gain, the judge said. Your actions have caused significant financial harm to your community and eroded the trust that is essential for communities to function. I am sentencing you to 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. You will also be required to pay full restitution for the amount stolen. Patricia's face crumpled, and she started crying as the bailiff led her out of the courtroom. Robert Morrison's sentencing was even harsher. The judge noted his criminal history. It turned out he had been involved in a similar scheme in California years ago, though he had only been sued civilly, not criminally prosecuted. The judge called him a serial fraudster who preys on communities and sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, plus restitution and fines. As we left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, anger at what had been done, and sadness that it had happened in the first place. Our community had been violated by someone we had trusted, and even though Patricia and Robert would be held accountable, the damage had been done. The civil lawsuit dragged on for another year. The attorney the HOA hired was aggressive in pursuing every possible avenue to recover funds. They went after Robert's business assets, Patricia's house, their retirement accounts, everything. In the end, the HOA recovered about $200,000 of the $340,000 that had been stolen. It was not everything, but it was something. The new management company that the HOA board hired was a well-established firm that had been managing communities in Arizona for over 20 years. They were transparent, professional, and actually did the work they were supposed to do. Our monthly dues went back down to a reasonable level and the special assessments stopped. Slowly, life in Riverside Meadows returned to something resembling normal. The pool got repaired. The streetlights were fixed. The graffiti on the fence was painted over. The scars of what had happened were still there, but the community was healing. Mike and I became minor celebrities in the neighborhood, known as the guys who uncovered the fraud. People would stop us during walks and thank us for speaking up. A few residents who had initially been skeptical or thought we were just troublemakers apologized for not taking our concerns seriously sooner. Amanda ended up joining the HOA board, bringing her financial expertise to help ensure something like this could never happen again. She implemented new policies requiring multiple bids for any work over a certain dollar amount, quarterly financial reviews by an independent accountant, and mandatory conflict of interest disclosures for all board members. One evening, about 18 months after Patricia's arrest, I was sitting on my back patio with Sarah, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was finally cooling down after another scorching summer day. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't looked into those invoices?" Sarah asked. I thought about it for a moment. They probably would have kept stealing until there was nothing left to steal or until someone else finally noticed. But yeah, I wonder sometimes. Part of me wishes I had just paid the fees and ignored it, you know? It was exhausting and stressful and it took over our lives for a while. "But you did the right thing," Sarah said. "You protected our community." "We did the right thing," I corrected her. Me, Mike, Amanda, all the neighbors who supported us. It took a lot of people standing up and saying this wasn't okay. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. It was a formal thank you for my cooperation in the investigation and prosecution of Robert Morrison and Patricia Hendricks. The letter noted that cases like this often go unreported because people do not think anyone will care about HOA fraud, or they do not think it's worth the effort to pursue. But your willingness to speak up and gather evidence was essential to achieving justice in this case, the letter read. Thank you for being a good neighbor and a good citizen. I put the letter in the folder with all the other documents from the case, the invoices, the bank statements, the police reports, the court filings. It was a thick folder now, a physical record of everything that had happened. I did not look at it often, but I kept it just in case. Evidence that when people in positions of trust abuse that trust, there can be consequences. The HOA held its annual meeting in November, and for the first time in years, it felt like a genuine community gathering rather than a performance staged by Patricia. The new board president, a retired teacher named Mr. Wallace, gave a straightforward report on the community's finances, the ongoing maintenance projects, and the plans for the coming year. Everything was transparent, documented, and reasonable. During the open comment period, Mrs. Johnson stood up and addressed the room. "I just want to say that I'm proud of this community," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "What happened with Patricia and that management company was terrible, and it hurt all of us. But the way we came together, the way we supported each other and fought to make things right, that showed me what this community is really about. We're not perfect, but we look out for each other." There was a long moment of silence, and then everyone started clapping. It was not a polite, perfunctory applause. It was genuine, heartfelt, a collective acknowledgement of what we had been through and how far we had come. After the meeting, Mike and I stood in the parking lot, talking about nothing in particular. The November air was cool and comfortable, a relief after the brutal Arizona summer. "You ever think about running for the HOA board?" Mike asked with a grin. I laughed. "God, no, I've had enough HOA drama to last a lifetime." "Fair enough," Mike said. "But you know, for a while there, I actually thought they were going to get away with it. Patricia seemed so untouchable, like nothing we did would matter." "Yeah, I felt that way too sometimes," I admitted, "but I guess the lesson is that you have to try anyway. Even when it seems hopeless, even when the people in power seem untouchable, you have to try." Mike nodded. "Truth. Well, I'm going home to watch the game. You want to come over?" "Nah, I told Sarah I'd help her with something, but thanks." We said our goodbyes, and I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside Meadows. The streetlights were all working now, casting a warm glow over the sidewalks. The common areas looked well-maintained, the grass trimmed, the bushes shaped. It looked like a community that was cared for, because now it actually was. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. I thought about everything that had happened. The suspicious invoice that started it all, the late nights researching and documenting, the meetings with police and prosecutors, the stress and anger and frustration. And then I thought about the outcome: 2 criminals in prison, money recovered, a community that had learned hard lessons about oversight and accountability. It had been worth it. Every difficult, exhausting moment had been worth it. I got out of the car and walked to my front door, where Sarah was waiting with a smile and a glass of wine. Inside, our home was warm and welcoming, a sanctuary in a community that we had fought to protect. And for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely at peace with where we lived. The months continued to roll by, and Riverside Meadows continued to thrive under its new management. The scandal that had once defined us gradually faded into the background, becoming a story that newer residents heard about secondhand, a cautionary tale about what can happen when people do not pay attention to where their money goes. I occasionally saw Amanda at community events, and she would give me updates on the financial health of the HOA. The reserves were growing, slowly but surely, rebuilding what had been stolen. The special assessment funds that Patricia and Robert had pocketed were being replaced through a combination of the recovered money and careful budgeting. "We're actually in pretty good shape," Amanda told me at a 4th of July barbecue the following summer. "Another year or two, and we'll be back to where we should have been if none of this had happened. The new management company has been great. They actually answer emails and show up to meetings." "It's amazing how novel the concept of a management company doing its job seems after what we went through," I said. Amanda laughed. "Right? The bar was literally on the ground." Detective Chen reached out to me one more time about 2 years after the initial arrests. She wanted to let me know that the federal money laundering case against Robert Morrison had concluded. He had been convicted on additional charges and received an enhanced sentence. Combined with his state sentence, he would likely be in prison for at least 12 years. "I wanted to thank you again for bringing this case to our attention," Detective Chen said over the phone. "Cases like this, financial crimes, white-collar fraud, they're often hard to prosecute because victims don't realize they've been victimized, or they don't think it's serious enough to report. But this was serious. These people stole from an entire community, and because you were willing to dig into the details and follow through, we were able to hold them accountable." "I'm just glad it worked out," I said. "There were times when I wasn't sure it would." "Most people would have given up," Detective Chen said. "You didn't. That made all the difference." After we hung up, I told Sarah about the conversation. She had been with me through all of it, supporting me when I was frustrated, encouraging me when I wanted to give up, celebrating with me when justice was finally served. "You did good," she said simply, and kissed me on the cheek. Life moved forward. The seasons changed, the Arizona heat came and went, and Riverside Meadows continued to be a good place to live. The homes were well maintained, the community spaces were clean and functional, and the people were generally friendly and neighborly. It was what we had hoped for when we first moved in, and what had been stolen from us for those few years when Patricia and Robert were running their scheme. Sometimes, I would drive past Patricia's old house, which had been sold to satisfy part of the restitution judgment. A young family lived there now with 2 small kids who played in the front yard. They had no idea about the history of the place, and that was probably for the best. It was their home now, their fresh start, unburdened by the past. I thought about the whole experience often, usually late at night when I could not sleep. I thought about how easy it would have been to ignore those invoices, to pay the fees without question, to assume that the people in charge knew what they were doing and had everyone's best interests at heart. That assumption, that trust, was what Patricia and Robert had counted on. They had built their entire scheme around the idea that people would not ask questions, would not dig deeper, would not care enough to hold them accountable. And for a while they had been right. People had not asked questions. They had grumbled about the fees, sure, but they had paid them. They had noticed that repairs were not getting done, but they had assumed it was incompetence rather than fraud. It was not until someone actually looked at the details, followed the money, and demanded answers that the truth came out. The lesson in that seemed important, broader than just HOA politics. In any system, any organization, any community, there need to be people who ask questions, who demand transparency, who are willing to be unpopular if it means getting to the truth. Not because they want to cause trouble, but because accountability matters. Trust matters. And when trust is violated, there have to be consequences. 3 years after Patricia's arrest, the HOA held a special meeting to discuss a proposed renovation of the community center. It was a legitimate project this time, with multiple bids from licensed contractors, a clear budget, and a transparent timeline. The board presented all the information to the community and took questions. An older man in the back row raised his hand. "How do we know this is legit? How do we know we're not being taken advantage of again?" It was a fair question, and one that probably would not have been asked before the scandal. Mr. Wallace, the board president, nodded sympathetically. "That's a very reasonable concern," he said. "And the answer is that we've put safeguards in place to prevent what happened before. All contracts require board approval by majority vote. All expenditures over $5,000 require documentation and review. We have an independent auditor who reviews our finances quarterly. And most importantly, we encourage every homeowner to stay engaged, ask questions, and hold us accountable. That's how we make sure it doesn't happen again." The room was quiet for a moment, and then people started nodding. The vote to approve the renovation passed by a wide margin. After the meeting, the older man who had asked the question came up to me. "You're the one who figured out what Patricia was doing, right?" he asked. "Me and a few other people, yeah," I said. "Thank you for that," he said. "I almost moved out, you know." After it all came out, I was so angry and disgusted that I thought about selling and going somewhere else. But then I realized that running away doesn't fix anything. The community is worth fighting for, worth staying for. You proved that. I shook his hand, not quite sure what to say. In the end, I just said, "I'm glad you stayed." And I meant it. Because that was the real victory, not the arrests or the convictions or even the recovered money. The real victory was that the community had survived, had learned, had become stronger and more vigilant. We had been betrayed, but we had not been broken. As I walked out of the community center that evening, I looked around at the place Sarah and I called home. The landscaping was neat, the lights were bright, the buildings were well maintained. But more than that, it felt like a real community again, a place where people looked out for each other and held each other accountable. It had taken a lot to get here. Countless hours of work, stress, frustration, and legal battles. But standing there in the cool Arizona evening, watching my neighbors chat and laugh as they headed to their cars, I knew without a doubt that it had been worth every minute. Because home is not just a place. It is a feeling, a sense of security and belonging. And sometimes, protecting that feeling means being willing to fight for it, even when the fight is hard, even when the odds seem long, even when it would be easier to just look the away. I had looked at those invoices on my kitchen counter and seen something wrong. I had chosen to investigate rather than ignore. And that choice, that one decision to pay attention and demand answers, had changed everything. As I drove home that night, I passed the entrance to Riverside Meadows with its freshly painted sign and well-lit landscaping. This was our community, shaped by the people who lived here and cared about it. Patricia and Robert had tried to exploit that care, but in the end, that same care was what brought them down. The lights were on when I pulled into my driveway, Sarah visible through the front window. I sat in the car for just a moment, grateful for this home, this community, this life we had built. Then I got out and walked inside, ready for whatever came next.